do that. But yeah, so if you have questions, feel free to put in the chat. Normally this talk takes about an hour and 15 if I go slow. So I'm going to definitely be cutting some stuff out. So so just know that this may be a little bit shorter than normal, and also know that we may not get to everything, and that's okay. So I'll go ahead and get started since it is the top of the hour here. So a little bit about myself. I won't spend too long on this. 4-year MVP. I help out in the XRM toolbox. I wrote the base plugin for all the XRM tools, basically, that use that. I've got some tools in there: Attribute Manager, Early Bound Generator, Visual Studio Solution Accelerator. Those last two are important. Would be important for this session just because the XRM unit test requires early bound. So that's a good tool to do that. And then the Visual Studio Solution Accelerator basically was designed to set you up with your plugins, with your early bound entities, and with your unit testing in a matter of a few less than a minute, actually. So something to definitely go check out and play with if you'd like. This presentation is on the XRM unit test. So I've created that. It's been around since I think Jordy and I started the framework about the same time. He just open sourced his a little bit earlier than I did. So it's been around since I think 2012, if I remember. And I'm from Fishers, Indiana, and I'm also on the XRM Toolcast. So if you love having developer specific stuff, we don't do all developer specific stuff. About half the content is going to be geared towards developers. So we just finished up having Scott Duro on there last week, and then it was actually a dual episode. He's on there twice. So that's me. So when I'm going to say unit testing in here, and I'm really not meaning unit testing for the most part. I'm really meaning like automated testing or maybe integration testing. There's certain levels that people that are going to be, I'll say, religious about it would be, this is unit testing, this is integration testing, this is functional testing. So I'm just going to say unit testing, but I'm really, because it's just faster to say that than automated testing or functional testing. So just know that. I'm also going to skip the why here. I'm not going to tell why you'd want to do it. The assumption is that you know what it is, you'd like to do it. You just would like help doing it specifically for your CRM plugins. And I am focusing on the .NET side of the fence explicitly. So your plugins, your custom workflows, and anything that's using the SDK, the .NET SDK. So I haven't provided any sort of support for the newer framework stuff, but at least .NET SDK, if you're still on that, that is definitely where this is specifically focused on. So this is kind of the couple ways of examining. I said that twice. It's a couple ways of actually how we go through and think about unit testing. There's the testing is for systems approach, which is our top one up here, and this is people that don't ever test unless it's in production. And so costs you nothing, but you don't gain anything. So you're actually kind of losing over time. Then there's the whole sort of automated ALM multi-server environment with the fully built out scripting engine that goes through and does all your testing on the front end and back end and everything else. That could take a long time to set up. And so it costs a lot to get started before you start to actually break even, how much time you invested in it and how much it's earned you and your business back before it starts to go up again. And then we have generic mocking frameworks, which aren't necessarily specific to anything CRM or CDS, but so they're very easy to get started. But you don't generally, each time you do a test, you have to completely mock out every single call that you're doing, which means you're not really allowing it to build on each other. So that's kind of where we sit at for the most part. So the XRM unit test and Jordy's framework as well are really going to be looking at this sort of thing where we can really get picked on it soon, and then things start to build on each other. So we start to see a vast improvement in how quickly you can write your tests and how powerful they can be. So that's just kind of what we're trying to level set here. So it is open source. At its core, it is that fake CRM service that Jordy would have as well in the fake XRM Easy. But there's also a couple other things that are designed explicitly for being able to connect and run your testing against the actual server itself. So that's another point as well. I also do a lot of Fluent stuff in the framework to make life a little bit easier for setting that up and for automatically setting up your entities and stuff like that. So real important for this one right here is this link right down here at github.com. If you want to go ahead and download this XRM unit test.example on GitHub, that's what I'm going to be walking through today. If you want to walk through it with me, great, go ahead and do it. It's on NuGet as well. I have never made a 2011 version because no one's asked for one, but it is out there for 2013, 15, 16, and 09. And if you do happen to be stuck in 2011, and may God have mercy on your soul, but if you let me know, I will be happy to create you a 2011 version if you'd like to try that out. So we're going to go get started here. So this is kind of example. How do you actually do testing of a plugin that doesn't actually connect to and do any data interactions in the actual test? So this plugin example is going to be a remove phone number plugin. It's going to go through and it's going to fire an update or create of a account or a lead or any of those types of entities that would have phone numbers associated to it. And that plugin is just going to go through and check to see if this phone number is there, and then it's going to remove anything that's not a number to the phone number. So anything that has a dash in there or a plus or a parentheses, any of that kind of stuff, it's going to remove. So that's just the plugin. Now, the beauty of that plugin is it never actually does an update or create or retrieve of any data from the database of CRM itself. It actually is going to just be doing the updates within the actual context itself. So first, I'm going to walk you through how do we go through and do a test with XM unit tests where you're just having to deal with creating that context and testing your plugin. So let's go ahead and dive into code. So hopefully I've shared my screen and not just PowerPoint, but quick run through of the plugin. This is using my plugin base, but doesn't have to at all. You can test with whatever you'd like. You can also test, you don't have to be using early binding in any of your stuff for the framework, but you do have to have it defined. So it uses that to determine what attributes you have and what those types are to make sure you have your type safety there. In my framework, I do go through and define when things should be executing. So pre-operation, create update for these entities, execute this method. Pre-operation, create update of these entities, execute this method. The method's pretty simple. It's just going to call this remove formatting method, which goes through, gets that particular attribute. So maybe telephone 1, 2, or 3. And then it's going to go through and do this kind of funny little function here where it gets all the values that are in that string where they are a number, and then it creates a string out of that and updates it. So this is going to remove anything that is not a numerical value, and therefore removes all the phone number formatting. And that way, when your users are wanting to search for a entity by phone number, they never type in any formatting. It just always is what's being done with the actual just the full phone number itself. So that's how the plugin's set up. So let's take a look at the actual test itself. So this is my naming of tests, what I'm actually going to test, the state, context test formatting, and then what the result should be, should remove formatting. So we have our standard arrange, act, and assert. And in this, we have the plugin that we're creating. So this is what we want to actually create. This is the subject under test. So you might call this an SUT here. And the method we want to test is the execute. So this looks kind of confusing here until you go backwards. The execute method requires an I service provider. So each time there's a service in the framework that you need, I provide a builder for it. So I've got a service provider builder, and you pass in a context with that. So it needs the context. So that context requires an I plugin execution context. So I've got a plugin execution context builder. And again, these are all fluent. So they say, all right, with the registered event, and I'm going to use the logic to pick the first registered event from my plugin. But if not, you could just go through and define, hey, this is going to happen on the update, or it's going to happen for this entity, and that kind of stuff. And then the target you want to put on there. So that's the target. In this case, it's a contact with this weird phone number of A-1-B-2-3-C. Hopefully that's not a valid phone number for anywhere in the world. But regardless, the test will make sure that once we call the execute method, that contact that we passed in there will actually be, as the target, will actually be updated to 1, 2, and 3. And as you can see, we are already passing. So rather than spending time running a test that we can see is already passing, I'll just leave that be. So this is the framework for how do you actually go through and set up the test to run against a plugin. How do we mock the plugin execution context? And it's with these fluent builders here to go through and create that stuff. Going back, let's see. So another major thing to be concerned about here is the difference between why would you actually want to use a framework like XM unit test versus just a generic mocking framework. I go look at, here's another piece of logic we're going to go through. This is make name match case. My last name has a capital B in the middle of it, and it's not very popular. So therefore, not very many people know that it's capital B. Actually, funny thing, I went to get my license renewed, and when I went to go do that, they had some more stringent rules of what your name could be, and they require your birth certificate. And apparently there's a space between the A and the B in my birth certificate, so they forced me to put a space in my driver's license. So I no longer have the same last name as my kids or my wife because now I have an A in the middle of my last name. So fun skis for me. I may have to change that. I don't know. But anyway, the whole point of this thing is you pass in a name like McDonald, let's say, and then it'll go through and find any contacts that have that name where it matches case insensitive. And then it's going to go through and check to see where, hey, they are case insensitive equal, but not case sensitive equal. And then it's going to update those values. So that's a simple one. We're using the XRM context in this case, an actual link to CRM, but it could just be normal updates and stuff like that. But that's the actual code. It's not a plugin. You're just testing this one specific public method that you're having to do. Okay. So if I go back to the actual test itself here, let's take a look at what this test looks like using XRM unit test versus using something like fake XRM. I'm sorry, XRM unit test versus MS Fakes. So MS Fakes comes as a part of the premium version or the enterprise version of Visual Studio. And this is how you have to set up this test. You would have to know, or the thing you're trying to fake out here is this call right here. I need to fake out this retrieve call, which actually happens right here on this to list we call. That's the actual retrieve request is done. And I also need to update these updates here as well. It happens in the save changes. So as a developer, I have to know, oh, well, that retrieve request is actually an execute request. And the execute request, then I've got to go through and determine, hey, is this the retrieve multiple request or is this the update request? So I got to have some sort of logic in here to determine what's happening. And if it's a retrieve multiple, I got to start building my response, the retrieve multiple response, setting up the results, going through and adding whatever the particular entity is. So in this test, last name McDonald with a lowercase. And then if it's the update, that gets returned. And then if it's the update, it just goes through here and says, all right, if it's not an update, you've added some other test, some other function that we haven't mocked out yet. So I don't know what to do. So this is basically crying uncle here. This isn't recognized. But then it actually takes that target and sets it to this value, which is outside, has a scope outside of this whole faking area here. And then your test runs and it checks as that value that, hey, make sure that it got set from that logic and that it got set to capital D in McDonald. Okay, because that's what we passed in, even though the return value here is lowercase d. This logic here, these 30 lines of code, it's really ugly. This is not how you normally code things for CDS. This is not how you normally code things in your plugins. This is just code that's very unique. And for a lot of people that are new to development, new to CDS development specifically, knowing that, hey, everything comes in as an execute organization request, not as a retrieve request, even though that is listed as a stub here possible on this fake. Like that's just really, really annoying, hard, difficult, and it's a lot of code to write. I really would rather not write 30 lines of code. So the reason that XRM unit test exists and fake XRM easy is you can do something like this. I've got a local CRM database organization service. So this is what I'd use for testing. I'm going to create it based on my early bound entities. So here's my context. That context is set in a namespace. That namespace should contain early bound entities. It does all the magic reflection to go figure out what those settings are, what entities you have that exist. And then I go through and actually create my contact just like I would if I was doing an update in the actual CRM itself, or in the plugin itself. So this is not anything special. This is the only line here that's special really to kind of unit testing here. Then I call my logic, pass in the I organization service, and then I do a assert here to make sure, hey, and I also go and retrieve that entity. Hey, make sure that entity actually got updated. Okay. So this is a much less code to write, which means much less bugs, and it's also much easier. Besides this one line here, which is maybe a copy and paste if you want to do it, but we'll get to how you kind of get around that in the future. It's really, really straightforward. So this is great. This works great. And it has the other advantage of fixing a bug. So let's say rather than comparing first name and last name, if I change this to first name and first name, because the in-memory CRM service actually does the querying of the in-memory database, this will actually result in a failing test versus the fake, the fakes framework or any sort of fakes framework. If you don't do a check in here, we don't do anything in this request to validate what it actually is. We just say, hey, if it's a retrieve multiple, then give it a response. We don't check to make sure that they actually checked for first name and last name or any of that stuff. So therefore, that test will fail, will succeed, even though there actually is a bug in there. So that's a big reason why using a specific mocking framework like XM unit test is a huge benefit to your testing, because now actually you're testing usually the most complicated part to the right, which is the querying stuff, or the most buggy part is the querying stuff. So that's the fun of going through and doing that. It's a whole lot less lines of code, way easier, and it looks like standard code, so it should be much easier to get started in your projects. So let's go through some of these limitations here and talk through these out. So your limitations of having that fake in-memory service is it's only as good as what you are checking for your metadata against. So if you're using early XM unit tests, that's using the early bound entities. So if those are out of date, or if you want to test a new environment, you have to regenerate those things. It's, it's something like the early bound generator. It's a few seconds to go through and do that, but it does take a little bit of effort. And if those entities don't match, you may have a test that is passing but fails in your actual environment. So that kind of is a rough pain point there. That doesn't handle anything with security permissions in the testing framework, mostly because to set that up requires a lot more work than generally I figure is worthwhile. And then, let's do that. It's not CRM. There's going to be bugs. There's going to be things that happen in CRM that don't happen. Maybe you do something really crazy and you create multiple, execute multiple requests, and you have a limit on how many times you could do that. And you're not seeing that locally because that limit isn't enforced locally, but in CRM it is. So that's an issue as well. And then here's the one that's really key here. If you only have testing that's done entirely in your local environment, it doesn't help when the environment is broken, but your tests aren't. So if I develop a plugin, it works great, all the tests pass, I push it out to dev, and I push it out to get dev, works in dev, I push it out to QA and it fails in QA, I've got nothing to fall back on to see why is this failing? Why is this not working? I don't have any way to be able to go through and kind of figure that out and have my tests help me do that. So that's another kind of thing where this is a limitation with this fake organization service. So to overcome these things, I recommend actually connecting to your CDS instance. But this creates an entirely new set of problems. You want to make sure that your tests are environmentally agnostic, meaning it doesn't matter what environment you run in, they still pass. You need to also make sure that you can specify between, hey, I want to run this thing locally or against the server, because running tests against the server takes a long time. And if you want to do any sort of development, having tests locally when you're doing server-side development, having a test locally is a huge productivity increase, because now it's not, hey, go ahead, compile, go ahead and push, go ahead and push out that test, whatever that test is, go ahead, wait for the log to come through, make sure verify that it works. If it doesn't work, you repeat the process. That's a 1.5 minute turnaround cycle. Versus if you run everything locally, you're talking seconds to go through and figure out, did I break it? Did I not break it? Does it work? Does it not work? And I can debug right there locally. I don't have to do any sort of weird connecting to CRM to try to debug remotely, which is cumbersome at best. So, but that's still the problem, right? The thing you have to deal with. How do you say, hey, I want to run this way, I want to run that way? And we always want to make sure that when we were doing this, it asks, do we have to do one test for local development, one test for server development, or is this, hey, we want one test that we can then switch back and forth? So which way should we do, option 1 or option 2? So I've gone through and decided option 2 is the approach that I like, but I do want to have that single port configuration, and I do just want it to work. So if you do have some sort of Azure DevOps pipeline where you want it to just grab the source code out and run the test, I want it to pass. I don't want there to be any sort of initial setup that has to be done in order for that test to work. So let's go through and see, how do you actually define to connect to your CDM instance, and how do you actually go through and do that work? So if we go back here, here's just the brute force method of actually connecting. I've got this test settings class that's used to configure some of the test settings required for XRM unit test. And in here, we need this user test config path. So this is, hey, I'm going to point to a single config file that is used for all of my test projects. So you may have 5 plugins. Each of your plugins may have a separate test project. Each of those test projects, you don't want to have the same config in each test project that you're having to switch back manually. So if you want to say, all right, run against a server or run against locally, you don't want to be setting the config file in every single one of those projects individually. You want one spot. And so that's what this thing is doing. It's a Pathfinder project of type. So basically, you give it a project type. So MS Test Provider is my project type that I'm giving here, or a class type I'm getting here. So that's right in here. And it says, all right, I'm going to go and find on disk where your path to that thing is. I'm going to find the project for it. And then you give it a project-specific path to a config file. In this case, unit test settings user.config. Okay, so that's this file here. You will also notice, maybe if you can, depending on how good the resolution is, there is a little ignored flag here. There's a little ignored flag here, and that's something special because you don't want to check in your actual password or anything like that to TFS, because that's obviously bad, or your source control. That's bad. So what I do is you check in this, which is generic, which has generic information in here. And at the bottom here is your password. The first time you go through and you run your test, it will look for this. The convention setup, if it's .user.config, it will look for a file without the .userconfig part of it, and then it will use that to go through and it will use that to go through to generate this file. And then once you've ran it once, you just go through and populate it with your username and your password, and then you can go through and start doing your work here. So in my unit test config, also notice the password's way at the bottom. That's just a simple way to keep things from, if I need to change it when someone's debugging with me, they can handle that. They can not see my password. So security through obscurity there. But you just change whatever sort of environment you want to choose, dev, QA, stage, or prod, or you can put however many of these you'd like to put in here, your connection configuration string you want to put in there. And then if you want to use local, it's true. If you set that to false and save it, then everything would start actually connecting to the actual CRM instance that you've defined here for every single one of your tests, since they all are using this config file. So I did get a question here in the chat. I did see about whether this is using fake XRM Easy or XRM Unit Test. So this is a different framework. This is XRM Unit Test is a different framework than fake XRM Easy. It's not using it underneath the covers, but it's the same exact idea underneath the covers, and that it's running the in-memory version of CRM. So hopefully that answered your question. Yo, looks like is her name is. Yeah. So at some point in time, maybe if people like the idea of being able to do all this kind of stuff, maybe we combine it and I ignore, remove, or replace the intersection of my. Actually, I go back to this thing. I go back to. Nope, not that one. This one line here that creates my own version, there's no reason you couldn't kind of go through and change that to be the fake XRM Easy to create your own instance of that. But yeah, so at some point in time, I may do that, may replace all that. But for now, I'm just sticking with my own because it works just fine for what I need to do. All right, back to the slideshow. Okay, so back to that. Not yet. Let's go to this first. So what I suggest doing is having a method that you call that goes through and sets up that connection for you. So in this test initializer class, and this all gets set up if you use the Visual Studio Solution Accelerator, I create this class for you and you can go through and configure it however you'd like to configure it. But these are everything you need to actually set up your XRM Unit Test to run in your project. So if you want to run, rather than MS Test, if you want to use fake XRM Easy, or not fake XRM, what's the other testing framework? One of the other testing frameworks, XUnit Test. You just need to create a provider for it. The provider is super simple. It just says, hey, what's the attribute that defines your test method? How do you do a failed? How do you do it in inclusive? Those are the three things. So whatever, very, very simple class to write. Should take you 5 minutes, if that. So you just configure that by setting that in. That does the early binding for that. And then here is the configuring of the unit test config. So these are the settings for that. So put that in one method, one file, and just call it for every your test. And now you've configured everything XRM Unit Test. So that is how you go through and actually set up the connections with XRM Unit Tests. So now that we've gone through and said, hey, how do we solve that problem? Let's go through and figure out how does that look like? What does that look like? So I'm going to give another hypothetical plugin, sync count to contact. And in this plugin, it's going to find on updated contact, it's going to find all accounts that have that contact as primary and are missing an address. So you're updating the contact. It is the primary in the count. The account doesn't have an address. Let's go ahead and sync the information from that contact to the account address. And maybe a dumb idea. I don't know. It depends on your situation. But coming up with examples is kind of hard here. So so that's our example plugin here. And let's go see what that actually looks like to test it. And first we're going to do, this is like the first pass at how you would go through and do your testing. So first you call your initialize test settings. Great, that sets up all your test data. And then I got a test base method that you can call get organization service that goes off and uses those settings to get your service. Great, everything's set up, looking good. This could go anywhere you want to. It doesn't have to be in this method. It could be at like a class level if you want. It just needs to run before the actual test runs. Then we have our service. Let's create our contact. Let's create our account. Let's associate the primary contact of the account to this contact that we just created. So let's set up for that. And then let's do our test here. We are going to create this as a target here. So this is our target. We're passing in address line 1 of 742 Evergreen Terrace. Any Simpsons fans will probably get that reference. Yeah, so that contact is created. And then we go through, we create our actual context itself. Hey, what is this registered for? This contact, and we do our actual providing of our builder. I'm also passing in this debug logger, which is really great because you get to see everything in every single request that's made to your iOrganization service is logged to your test results. So in your test results, you should be able to see, let's see if I can get this test here. This is for the local or, that's not the reason, that's what I want, room phone number. Would this one give me my test? Nope, it won't. Sorry, I haven't ran it since we started this. So let's go ahead and run this local or servers not being found. What class is this in? Or server. Oh, there it is. I can't read it. People looking at me. All right, so I'm just gonna go run both these tests. But that will log out everything that's happening, trace everything that happens in your plugin, which is really, really neat. Okay, so we have our act, and then we have our cert to make sure, hey, did that account get created correctly with the, or get updated correctly to have the same address line 1 as the contact did. Okay. And then finally, when we're done, now we need to make sure that we're environmentally agnostic and clean up the data that we created. So since we created our contact and our account, we need to make sure we actually clean it up when we're done with it, which is great, but this actually comes into a problem. So let's see how many of you have figured out our problem here. Well, let's dive into that. So first, I don't like that we have to do this at the top each time. That's just boilerplate. So I want to get rid of that. That's a problem that we have with this example here. The main problem here is that we have this try catch here with a finally here. If you have a bug anywhere in your logic, so if I've got a bug in my plugin and I'm executing my plugin, I'm debugging my plugin and it fails, that's bad, right? But what happens normally is you stop on that plugin and you will actually stop your test running, and then you will rerun your test. Well, if you stop your test running when you're in here, the finally never runs. So therefore, you've created this account and this contact, and you're just going to create a new one next time, and you could potentially start creating lots and lots of dummy data in your test environment because you haven't cleaned it up correctly. So the only way that I know of to really kind of clean that up is to keep track of the GUIDs from the contact and the account. Great. So you could keep track of them. You could hard code them in here if you wanted to and create them that way, but that's a lot of work as well. So that's really annoying as well. But if you did do that, then at the end here, you would just always delete it. Oh, and you also would have to delete it at the beginning to make sure that it didn't exist already. So you'd have to have the line here say, all right, I'm cleaning up from the previous test. I'm creating my test data. And then down here, you tend to clean it up again. So if someone logs into your environment, it's not seeing any of this crap data in there. So so those are rather annoying to overcome. So I think we actually talked about all this stuff here, but here's the important part. So when we're testing at this, we always have to make sure that our costs justify the means. We always have to make sure that happens. So when I talk about having that ID and keeping track of that, that really is annoying, but that's something that we have to do to make sure that it's clean, but we have to do it in a way that's as efficient as possible. So we want to make sure on this, effort versus return, that we're hitting the top of this graph here, and we're not spending time here, or we're spending time here making this absolute perfect thing that takes 20 days to create. We need it to be created now and out the door and beneficial. So this is my answer to how do we do this. So my answer first is, hey, how do we overcome limitations of the in-memory local CRM instance? How do we overcome that? Well, that's to connect to CRM or CDS. And if we connect to it, how do we overcome all those issues with those connections? Well, we've gone through how do we get connected, but let's take a look at how we actually help our test out. So I have this test class here, test method class base. I have a hard time coming up with names. That's the best name I could come up with it. But basically, it's a base class for your test method. Whoa, isn't that crazy? So here's our test method. It creates this new instance of this class. So each method gets its own special class, primarily for it does a lot of stuff with reflection that requires that. And then you can also be sure that you're not using the same data in other classes. You're not using the same GUIDs in other classes. And therefore, you will not be able to run things multi-threaded if you want to. So I always want to make sure that you can run things multi-threaded without having to worry about stepping on each other. So the first thing you notice here, we have this weird structs ID. So if you ever done any MVC development, ASP.NET MVC stuff, they use a lot of convention over configuration, where if you name your thing this way, it will work. If you do it this way, it will work without you having to tell it what to do. So my answer to going through and keeping track of your GUIDs is to put them in this struct here called, you don't have to actually call it IDs, but it's going to be a struct that contains these ID entities, ID classes, ID objects. And in here, you've defaulted the actual GUIDs here, which is great. But now that those are defaulted, now it can use that to clean it up. And because it's structured in this way, this test method class base, when it runs through and actually executes, before the test, it will go and it will look for these entities and it will automatically delete them ahead of time. And then when your test is done, it will automatically delete them afterwards. So when we're looking in this case with this weird finally here that we have to make sure we do to clean up our data, if you're a developer, you know developers are not, if you don't force them to do it, they're not going to do it. So there will be someone that forgets to clean up their data, guaranteed, which is really annoying. But if you set it up this way, they don't have to remember. They just have to put the IDs in. And on top of it, this service that you get passed in here, by default, it already is forcing you to define the IDs. If you don't define the ID, it will throw an error. Say, hey, you're attempting to create an entity that you don't know how to clean up. And that's a bad thing for our test to make sure that environment is clean. So it automatically does that for you as well, which is a nice little feature there. So this is IDs here. Let's create our data here. So just as before, we want to create our contact, and we our account. We want to associate it. I'm sorry, to our account. So that's this one weird line here. These IDs is I don't know why, but I love IDs. I should probably put them in a separate downloadable entity because it just kind of makes sense for this. But let's say, for example, you wanted to get the actual logical name of the account, right? You could just write this. You set account, and that will get you the logical name. Let's say you want the actual GUID of the account. You could just write IDs.account. And that gives you the GUID. Let's say you want the, this is the annoying one, entity reference. Let's say you want the entity reference of the account. You could just write that. In all these cases here, or heck, let's just want the entity. Cool. Oh, that one's not working. I think it has to be account. There we go. All right. So yeah, in all these cases here, this thing's smart enough to go, what are you asking for? Oh, and it just automatically gives it to you. You don't have to write any additional logic for that. Entity reference is always a really annoying one. But then if you do want the actual account itself, there is this .entity in here to get the actual entity, and now you've got the full IntelliSense for your entity as well. So real neat little thing. I don't know why I love it so much. It's so simple, but yeah, I just like it. Anyway, so that sets that up, and then I have this environment builder that you just give it the struct, and it will create all of them for you automatically. So I don't have to have any separate statements. I just says, oh, go ahead and create this thing. So if I have 20 different entities here, it creates them all, no problem. So that's a nice little feature there. And then we have our test with our arrange, act, and assert. And you will notice that this is basically what was inside of our try up here. We are generating our target, plugin, context, going through and creating all this stuff, and then we're executing it at the end and asserting that it is correct. So if I go look at the, let's do this one here. if I go look at the output for this, you will see everything that happened in this test. First thing it did is it went and checked to make sure that we did not have the account existing and we did not have the contact existing. If they did exist, then it would go through and delete them. So that's the first thing that happened. That was all done as the plugin base. And I looked at that actual GUID struct there, ID struct there. Then there's some other stuff in here. Did our actual create of the entities here and initialized all the data. Great. And then it actually started a timer. So you see timers of how long each thing took. That took 267 milliseconds. We see our collector. Hey, get me the account. All the counts where the primary contact is this GUID from the contact. It's great. And actually, I'm logging it twice because my plugin actually logs it information as well. So that's why you see that in there twice. But that took 0.036 seconds. So hopefully that was fast enough for you. And then here's our update where it goes through and actually does the update to make sure that it gets the correct address here. So you get to see all that information and you go, oh, I'm updating the country. Maybe I don't want to update the country. So you can fix that as well. And it wraps everything up for at the end of it. It will go through and clean up it deletes 2 entities here. Took 81 milliseconds. So it did all that work for us automatically, and you get to see that all in the actual context itself, the output of the test itself. So real nice feature there as well. So I walk through all this stuff. Okay, so I did show the environment builder. There are entity builders as well, and that helps to just speed up your actual test creation. So let's take a look at that as well. I think I've got them in here. Nope, I don't. But basically a plugin, actually I have it down here. Should have it down here somewhere. Yeah, here's account builder. So this account builder is something that gets called automatically whenever you create a new account, and it goes through and it will run this logic here to default everything. So by default, every single account I create is going to give a account number of 10. You can always update it if you need to, but it will give it account number 10. If I wanted to make sure that it had a specific address, I got this account builder to say, hey, give me this specific address when you create this thing. This reads a whole lot better in your tests, these Fluent builders, than having to hard code this in every single test that you want an address. Just say, hey, with this account builder, I want to create an address. That is used, right here. So, hey, I'm going to create an account here. Here's the account I want to create. And then with address 1, and I'll create it with the actual address for you. So account builder is very, very helpful. And that's a part of the curve that you continue to build on as you realize, oh, I'm constantly creating leads that have this specific information, or constantly creating accounts that have this. You can go through and build builders to help keep yourself from having to type everything quite as much. So that's a big boon there. So those are the builders. Other things. Other things we want to talk about. We don't. Actually, I'm doing really well on time here, so maybe I'm talking too fast. But there are some times when you're connecting to an environment where you don't want to create everything for your test. Okay, and I'm thinking specifically of like products. Products are annoying to create. You have to have the right unit of measure. So that means in your test, if you're going to create a product and that organization service implements making sure that you have that unit of measure just like the real CRM would, that means you've got to create your unit of measure first. And it's just annoying to go through and do that for every single one of your tests that you need a product, where maybe you have a standard product. Maybe you have your standard widget that you've had since the beginning of the company, or you had, maybe it's a service that you're doing that you've always had. Hey, we are a basic service. It's going to exist in every single environment. Rather than going through and having to just find in every single test what this product is, all the information for it, you can create what's called an assumption. So an assumption here, if I go look at this product install, all it does is it inherits from this entity data assumption base attribute, which is a part of the framework. And you can implement this interface as well. This just says, hey, this entity, this assumption returns this specific entity type product. And all you do is define this retrieve method. And so this retrieve method will go through and it will get, I'm using some of my DLB extension methods here. So this get first to default is doing pretty much exactly what you think. Give me the first product where the product number equals install, and give me these fields on it. Product number, product ID, description, boom. So that's going to retrieve the product. So when you write that assumption, it will, and then you have to actually append it to your class. So if I go back through here, there's a test here. In here, I've defined, all right, this class here, this test class install should contain description, is assuming that this product install exists. Okay. And so when I run this against an actual CRM instance, it will just make sure that my assumption is there. And if my assumption is there, great. It will just let the test run. If the assumption is not there, you're going to error right away to say, hey, this is not working because this assumed entity doesn't exist. So in my example at the beginning of this, when I talked about, hey, if you actually want to test, if you have a plugin that's failing in QA and you don't know why, but it's passing in dev, it could be that you have an assumption set up incorrectly. So when you run this test against that particular environment, not only would you be able to debug everything that's happening and get every other thing that's happening with that prioritization service against the actual real live instance of CRM or CDS, you would also see if there's any assumptions that have been invalidated. Hey, this product doesn't exist that should exist. And it's a simple thing for that. So we added it there. The first time you go through and run it, you need to be connected to an actual real live version of CDS. And the reason for that is when you run it, it will go through, and depending on your configuration, it will spit out the XML to this folder that you've defined here. So now now it splits out this XML here, install, here's the GUID, here's the description. Great, those are the things I set out. Once that gets defined, that can get checked into TFS or into whatever, GitHub, whatever you got, Git, any whatever you want to check it into, whatever your source control repository is. You check that in, now you can run it locally, and then local method, it will go through and go, oh, you need this product install. It will go and load it from the entity XML that has defined here and populate it inside your in-memory database before your test runs. So even though I haven't defined that my product exists at all, it will exist. It's in this local CDS instance, and I'll also add to this assumptions entity, the assumed entities collection here. You can go and get that actual product out by the actual type. So hey, get me the product install, and that will get you the actual product. And then you can go and check to say, hey, give me the description for that product from the actual service. So this actually will exist. And then you can check to see, hey, it's not null. Hey, the description matches the description that I am expecting it to be. So that's how that all works. That's the assumptions. Assumptions are very, very powerful for being able to do all that stuff. If you have any configuration data, let's say that you are storing in CDS and entity URLs to external services, very, very common. Someone asked the question. So yeah, so if you have another service that you're connecting out to another external service, I'm connecting out to Azure or something else, and so I've got code in my plugin that's doing that, and I don't want to hard code that in my test, right? So what you do is you say, all right, I'm going to make an assumption that this settings entity exists, and here's the query to go get it. So you probably have some string key to go get that thing, and then it will return that and it will store that, and it will save that in your entity assumptions entity XML here. And then when you run in memory, it will go through and it will pull that information in, and it will automatically go and use those settings, which is great. It's also really good because then when you run that in QA or a different environment, it will re-pull those settings from there because you're running from that environment, and it will hit that specific environment. So not only are you getting the ability to kind of debug stuff against that environment, you're also being able to, if you set it up to use your assumptions, you're being able to make sure that that data that exists in that environment is the data that actually is why it's causing it to fail, or could be why it's causing it to fail. Maybe the QA environment is pointing to the dev environment, that settings entity. So you wouldn't know that without a whole lot of kind of testing and figuring out what's going on. But if you had the unit test, you could connect to it. You could go through and step on it. You can go put a breakpoint right in your plugin and go, oh, okay, this is failing because I've got the wrong URL here, and you can go through and fix that. So, so those assumptions really, really powerful. You can abuse them probably, but they're also really, really powerful. Highly recommend thinking about involving those in your project. So those are the assumptions. And I walked a little bit in the builders. I'll go through that if I have more time. One thing I want to go through is there is a lot of code to write, unfortunately. I haven't figured out how to get that down even farther. So I'll make life a little bit easier for you. When you, if you look at this code generation here, you will see these snippets out here. And these snippets are designed to make your life way, way easier in what they're doing. So let's go and create a new, I'm going to create a new test class here. So this is using test method class base. If I had to go through and remember, how do I do this again? How do I handle this? It's kind of confusing. So let's say we have a test that some other product doesn't exist. And let's do a simple test here. So if I go and follow my little snippet here, CRM test method class, that's the step I'm going to use here. And I do the tab here to the autocomplete. I did it twice. So state being tested. When Daryl presents, it should be awesome. We'll do that one. Cool. And the plugin name is foo. I don't have a plugin for it yet, but okay. So that spit out this whole framework of, here's your test method you want to call. Here's a test class. Here's the ID structs. Maybe you don't need to create any entities and you can just delete the ID struct, but hey, it's right there. So maybe I need to create some IDs. Here's initializing the test data. So I need to have the, if I need to do that as well, that's already spit out. And then we have our actual test here where our range, act, and assert. So let's first think about this. Let's say that, hey, I do need to create quite a few entities. So what I do for that, because creating a GUID in Visual Studio is really kind of sucky. There is a create GUID tool here. And then you've got to, I guess, pick whatever version GUID format you want here, and click OK to get that. So copy that new GUID, and then you have to go paste it. And then it's got to be in the string. It's really clunky. Really don't like it. And if you need to create 10 entities, that's a pain. That's a pain. No one wants to do that. So what I've done is I've created a little link pad snippet called generate IDs. Let's open that up. All right. So let's say I need three contacts, and let's say I need an account, and let's say I need two leads here. Okay. All right. So it's kind of weird that you're putting in twice, but catch me on this. So I go ahead and run this thing. When I run this thing, it will spit out for me everything here that I want. I'm going to copy and paste this in here so it's a little bit easier to see. And now you see, okay, I've got the account. Notice, because I'm OCD, it alphabetized it. So the account goes first, and then the contacts and the leads. Notice also, because I have multiple accounts, contacts, rather than having contact 1, contact 2, contact 3, I've got a contact struct with A, B, and C to make life a little bit easier there. Same thing with leads, A, B, and C as well, and all those GUIDs are generated. So then, in a matter of seconds, I can create a lot of entities if I do need to create them, do need to define them, all in that nice ID struct and all ready to be utilized. Actually, I probably need to put that in the ID struct. There we go. And being able to be utilized in my test. Okay, so that makes life simple as well. Other snippets here, the range, act, and assert for a plugin can be a little bit daunting as well, because you're like, oh, I've got a plugin. Do I have a plugin up here to use? No. So let's say I have a plugin. What plugins do I have here? All right, race condition plugin. So var race condition plugin. Please autocomplete for me. Okay, it's good. All right. All right, so how do I test this thing? Race condition plugin dot execute. Okay, and then where'd I go from here? Oh yeah, I need that service provider, so I got to do that kind of stinks as well. So snippet for that is this CRM plugin test snippet. So CRM plugin test, and then this was the race condition plugin. I can spell it right. And then this kind of spits out everything as default what you'd need. A context, service provider. If you happen to need it with registered events, great. If you need a target with target, you can add that there. If you need a pre-image, let me put that new line. Pre-image, you can have that there as well. Whatever you want to put in there, and you start filling in all the information that you need to fill in with your context and service provider. So that's yeah. So that makes life a whole lot easier than going through and trying to type that out all by hand. So I also have builders for assumptions. If you want to create an assumption, if you want to create an entity, all that kind of fun stuff. So all that stuff can make life way, way, way simpler than just simple having to type everything out manually. And you know what? I even threw a region snippet in here. Why a region snippet? Because I don't know. Whenever I do a region, I like having the bottom have the comment at the top. I don't know why, but just because by default, I think Visual Studio does this. And so when I'm down here, I'm like, what region was that for? And I don't know. So anyway, extra bonus there. So that is that. Anyone have any questions before I maybe take a little bit more time to look at maybe some more entity builders stuff, because I kind of glossed over that quickly. But any questions anybody wants to ask, or anything they want me to dive into or talk about, show more into? Okay. Once, going twice. If you go download this example, or if you use the Visual Studio Solution Accelerator, Cole asked a question: is there a way to prove that an entity is only updated once and only certain fields have been updated? Is there a way to do that? So if you want to do something very specific in that, what you'd probably would need to do then is to actually override that in your actual test. So Phil's asking, let's go to another test. Let's do that. All right. So in the test here, the question was, hey, if I am getting multiple updates, how do I check that I've had multiple updates, right? So what you could do is service equals new organization service builder, autocomplete, there it goes. Okay, so I add in this service builder, you can put things on it. So you can say, hey, with update, and then here, then you're doing your actual action for that update. So it requires the service and the entity, okay? And so if you wanted to keep track manually, of how many times you're getting updated, so var updated equals 0, updated ++, and then that thing's just going to call the s.update. That should be, and then we got to call the build. So what this logic here would be to do, anything that's on the organization service, if you need to do something kind of unique or different or whatever, you can go through and define, hey, I want to see how many times this updated has happened. And so that would, this would run through each time update happens, it just increments that updated. If you wanted to check to see if it's the same entity, great. If you wanted to create this as an actual method, you can. This organization service builder is one that I recommend you create your own instance and you inherit from. So a lot of stuff that I have are called base because I want you to create your own instance. I don't want, so that way you can add whatever you want custom to it. So if you wanted, if that is important to you, then you can add your own override here and say, all right, give me this, automatically do this for me and add this feature to that organization service builder. So yes, you could do that. And then the other question was, and then you could go check to see what in here you can see in the actual update entity, what attributes have actually been updated. You go through and check to see what the count of those. Whatever logic might be specific to that test. So that's that question.
This is awesome. This is awesome. Can you zoom in a little bit, please?
That better?
Yeah, a little bit more.
Okay, I'm at 214%. So hopefully that's good enough.
Okay, just leave it. Okay, it's fine. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Dinesh asked, if I have to use multiple entities because each one has different requirements for the test, what is the best way to store that fake data? So if you need to create multiple entities for the test, you define your multiple GUIDs up here, and then you wouldn't necessarily be storing that fake data. You'd just be creating it for the test. If you're doing it multiple times, then I'd use an entity builder and define it there. Say, hey, go ahead and create these. I need these 10 things. Maybe you want an account with 10 contacts. Maybe there's 50 tests that you do that. Okay, I'm going to create an account builder and create a method so it's with 10 contacts, and then it would go through and create those contacts for you. So that's how I would handle that. Lucas asks, what would be good use case for assumption if I want to test a plugin that operates on a product like you use the entity builder and arrange single product and test that? In my case, assumption would pull 1,000 products. I'm wondering that test there, except maybe data integrity test. So assumptions really aren't for grabbing all the data from your environment, because most likely that those environments going to change. You really shouldn't be having assumptions on contacts and accounts because those most likely don't exist in all your environments. I'm just going to make sure I understand the rest of the question. Would be a good use case for assumptions if I want to test a plugin that operates on a product, like use any builder and arrange single product and test that. Okay, yes, and if you yeah, and you totally don't have to use an assumption if you don't want to for those products. If you wanted to create an entity builder that created a product, great. Just know you'll have to also create a unit measure for that test and some other things as well that are enforced when you actually attempt to create those products. So it's just however you'd like to set up that test. It's up to you. Nothing forcing you to use it one way or the other. So Lucas, hopefully that answered your question. And I know I'm getting out of time here, so I'm going to just show a couple more slides here since they are here. We're talking here. So these are the assumptions I talked about. They throw an error if they don't exist. Great. And they're pretty easy to create. Define that already. We looked at the entity builders. Entity environment builders are really powerful. So I highly recommend checking out, if you have some time, these environment builders here. They can do some pretty fancy things here. For example, let's say I'm going to create, so here's an example of using a entity builder within the environment builder and then creating all the other ones. But it will also handle, I think I got an example for this. It will also handle any of the parent account relationships. So if I want to create an account and a contact, I can say, all right, this account is going to have these child entities contact, and it will automatically create those in the correct order. And you will notice I don't specify a attribute here. It will automatically find the associations in your early bound entities, and it will create that for you. So you don't have to go through and define, hey, this contact, this account, this contact static parent account is this. You don't have to do that. It does it for you. And that's for anything custom entities or non-custom entities. So that's also another reason why I depend on early binding, because it helps to do this sort of magic through reflection. So yeah, so I don't know how many times if you have to create a test and you've got 5 different entities that are all like parent entities, that's really annoying. If let's say you've got more than one contact you need to have here, you could have multiple listed here, so you accept as many parameters you want to have that association, and they don't have to be the same entity type. So I could have a lead or any other sort of entity that would have the account relationship to it, and it would go through and handle those appropriately and make sure they all get created in the correct order. Yeah, notice that there isn't any sort of providing what order I want these things created in. It creates it in whatever order it needs to be done. So that's some magic there, I guess I should say, or it's magic that I think is there. Okay, let's go on to questions. So if you need to get a hold of me, I'm on Twitter. Check that out. YouTube, I've got some stuff on there. GitHub. If you do send a request on LinkedIn, please send a message with your request and just say, hey, I saw you in the D365 Saturday dev thing. If you don't, I will send you a message first and say, hey, how do you know me? Because it's really helpful if like a year and a half later someone sends me a message, I can go back and say, oh, this is how I know that person, especially if we haven't met before. So please do that there. And then I'm going to leave it on the thank you and see if we have any other questions here. So please fill out the survey. Apparently you can win a prize, and apparently I can win a prize of being the best presenter if you guys say how awesome I was or something like that. So yeah, highly recommend doing that. Anything else that I am missing? And documentation, it would be out on the GitHub site. You can find out there. Yeah, the GitHub site for XM unit tests. So I gave that at the very beginning of the presentation slide. Let's see, you're going to do this way. Slide here. All right, cool. So LaBar XM unit test is the slide for that. Okay. Scott versus Daryl for me going to be some tough choices. Scott versus yeah, no, it's not a tough choice. Just go with me. Oh, you can vote for both? No, vote for me twice, Danish. That's the way it should work. So, all right, my time's up. Thank you for joining me. Hopefully you found it helpful, and feel free to post out questions. And if you're going to use it, highly recommend that Visual Studio Solution Accelerator plugin for the XM Toolbox. It can download that for you, and you can start playing with it right away, and should have the test all set up for you. So, yeah, it's just a decade worth of CRM development given to you.
Thank you, Daryl. This was a really nice, full presentation. Hopefully, people will go in and then start